The Indian Mutiny of 1857, known in India these days as the First War of Independence, a bitter, hard-fought conflict in the sweltering heat of northern India. It's a war we've covered here on Redcoat History before, but it's a fascinating conflict that saw a small number of redcoats massively outnumbered and surrounded, far from support and short on supplies. It was a war that showed Victorian British society at its best and at its worst. I think it's a war we should study and remember. Well, today I'm joined by the wonderful Eva Chatterji to discuss her new book, Lucknow Residency, A Story of 1857. The defence of the British Residency in Lucknow by a meagre force of soldiers and civilians was an epic struggle for survival against the odds. It's a battle that showed British pluck at its finest. Let's hear more.
As we know, the mutiny had a variety of reasons as to why it started. I mean, whether it was, the cartridge question, whether it was bad pay, whether it was officers who no longer really cared about their men. Yeah, it was a wide variety of disaffections all happening at once. But Lucknow was a little bit more special because it was quite literally a revolt of a people who were trying to redeem their own past. It was a whole amalgamation of issues because Lucknow is in the province of Awadh, and it had been annexed in 1856 by the British, and they had been using their good old ploy, the doctrine of lapse, basically saying that the king, Wajid Ali Shah, was incompetent to rule. And this, of course, upset not just the sepoys, because Awadh was their main recruiting ground. It also upset the landed gentry, the villages, the local people. They really created quite a mess for themselves. So it was a lot of disaffection going on. So on top of having a military mutiny, which started in the ranks as it always did, as in other places, it was suddenly a people who had seen their king was taken away from them. And in his administration, even if it was bad, it was at least something that they understood. And this change of government was followed by a very dramatic summary settlement of revenue, which went ahead and upset a lot of the influential landlords who lost a lot of property. And they no longer had the wealth and the power that they'd had before. So they really went out of their way, the British, to upset a vast majority of people. It was the stupidest thing was that they were really thinking they were probably doing good. But they basically trampled on caste, culture, tradition, and long-lasting soul, basically the whole soul of the people. They completely misunderstood what was happening in Awadh.
So obviously, in early May, you have the uprising sort of beginning, and you have the soldiers all go to Delhi. But it takes a long time for that to really kick off in Lucknow, doesn't it? Can you just give us a brief description of how things developed in Lucknow in the build-up to the fighting actually beginning?
Well, in Lucknow was interesting because they were basically biding their time. I mean, they had separate small uprisings going on. The first uprising was in May when the soldiers refused the cartridges, but this was quickly put back down again. They came to their senses, and those who did not were dismissed. There was some disarming going on, but they managed to quell that one. Then there was the police brigade that was unhappy. It was a local levy, so they managed to quell that as well. Sir Henry Lawrence was doing his very best to address as many grievances as he could. So while dealing with an army that was getting more and more annoyed, he was also trying to address some of the other problems that were being felt by the people of the city. So he was trying to hold his position. He was trying to hold his post. I mean, he wasn't foolish. Sir Henry Lawrence knew that it was basically a matter of time before the army came and had their uprising. He was not under any illusion that Lucknow would be spared, but he was trying to do his best to ensure that that he could push it off as long as possible, that there wouldn't be the same fury and surprise as there was, for example, in Meerut. He was trying very much to avoid that. So when it finally did come, they were ready. They were ready. The British were actually ready for them.
So we've got a picture of Sir Henry Lawrence on screen now, looking deep in thought there. He was in charge both politically and militarily in Lucknow at the time. Is that correct? And if so, can you tell us what sort of man he was and what his background was?
Yes, Henry Lawrence was in charge of just about everything that was Lucknow. He'd been sent there very late. He was sent there actually only in March 1857. So his time, time between the actual uprising and the start of the siege, he had very little time to work with. But he did his best. I mean, he was a very experienced political officer. He had already had a very long career in India. He'd arrived in India in 1822, and he was originally an artillery officer. But he managed to get himself into civil employ after the Burmese War. So he changed to the Revenue Survey of India, and in 1841 he actually marched to Kabul. So he had had his military experience and his political experience was all ongoing pretty much at the same time. And then they found that he was actually very much a man that they needed in civil employ. So he served as the resident of the Kingdom of Nepal, and then they found him a political position in Lahore. So in 1847, he was appointed to the governing board of the newly annexed province of Punjab. And there was a quote that they used to say for Henry Lawrence that nobody has ever done so much towards bridging over the gulf that separates race from race, color from color, and creed from creed. Nobody has ever been so beloved. Nobody has ever deserved to be so beloved as Sir Henry Lawrence. So he made quite some waves in wherever he was. He was fair, and he was also a very gifted linguist. So he tried his very best to understand problems from all sides. And one of the reasons he was actually pushed out of Punjab was because he was having fights with his own brother. And he ended up as the Governor General in Rajputana from 1853 until he was sent to sort out the mess that was Lucknow.
So as Sir Henry Lawrence could see trouble brewing here, how did he start to prepare the Residency for defence, and what units did he have at his disposal? Who could he count on?
Well, Sir Henry Lawrence started preparing the Residency fairly early. I mean, initially he wasn't quite sure whether he was going to take the magazine in Machi Bhavan, if he was going to be using that as his place of defence, or if he was going to be using different posts in Lucknow. You would have to imagine that the cantonment was very much spread out in different areas. So he had to kind of figure out what would be the most sensible thing to do. Eventually, he decided that the best place to use was the Residency, which is a collection of buildings that made for him the most sense. He actually started reinforcing the Residency quite early. He was already at it in April, getting supplies in, starting with fortifications, moving in guns. He did not make any. He didn't try to hide what he was doing. He was basically saying, "Look, this is going to come and this is going to happen. So let's be prepared." And when the fighting finally did start, he had 600 men from the 32nd, a very weak company of the 84th. And at the start of the siege, he had about 712 Indian troops from the different mutinied regiments, and a vast amount of volunteers. So he didn't have a lot of fighting power to begin with, but he was going to do his best to make sure it worked.
But then fighting kicked off, and I think on the 30th of June was the Battle of Chinhun, where he sort of sallied out of the Residency, I believe, but actually got beaten. Can you give us a brief overview of what happened?
Well, the Battle of Chinhun, actually the problem there really was he had sent out volunteer cavalry to reconnoiter the day before to try and figure out if there's any enemy in the near vicinity, if there's anyone he needs to be worried about. And they came back with a report that said, "Yeah, well, there's a small group of sepoys that we saw, and a small group of local levies. They're gathering, but it's not much to worry about." And Henry Lawrence actually did not want to meet the enemy in the field. He wanted to consolidate his position at the Residency and make his defense as strong as possible for when the problems actually started, because until then, Lucknow was quiet. Even on the 30th of June, it was still quiet. He was convinced by his advisors that he needs to make a strong show of power. So he got his force together and off he went. On the 30th of June, 9 o'clock in the morning, they left the residency, expecting to find a small force of mutinied sepoys in the neighborhood who they could quickly, put down and then go back home. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way. The force that he found in the field amounted to about, numbers vary, but anywhere between 5,000 and 7,000. And he was meeting them with a force of approximately 600. Things went bad extremely quickly. They marched out, and when they came to a junction at Ismail Ganj, not actually at Chinhun itself, the fighting already started. They suddenly came under fire, and they also found that the sepoys had been spending the evening in preparing their own positions. They had stone walls ready. They were in a village behind walls. They had their guns ready. And so they knew that the British would come. And within a few moments, the 32nd came under tremendous fire. They couldn't advance and they couldn't retreat. The officers of the 13th Native Infantry managed to push their men forward, and they attacked the village to the right. But the rebels were far too well entrenched that they couldn't make any dent on their position. And then to add to Lawrence's problems, the Indian artillerymen cut the traces of the horses and ran off. The detachment of local police that he'd taken out with him all changed sides. His Sikh cavalry, who had been in the forefront, they suddenly panicked and fled. So he was basically left in the field with his men dropping like flies and an extremely strong rebel force that he couldn't beat. So the only thing he could do was call a retreat. And he called his retreat, and along the entire retreat, they were being severely harassed by flanking maneuvers from the left and the right, from the infantry and cavalry. And he did his best to bring his men back, and he set up guns. He actually went out into the field with 8 guns, but he swiftly ran out of ammunition. And he set up the guns on the bridge over the last river crossing back to the residency, and he ordered them to make it look like they will open fire even though they had no ammunition left. But the ruse was enough to frighten the attackers to moving back. And then he pushed the voluntary cavalry forward and told them, look, do your best. And they amounted to not more than 36 men, but they charged. They charged the oncoming sepoys and they charged the oncoming cavalry and managed to cause enough disarray in their ranks that they ran for it. But it didn't really help. I mean, they managed to bring out one more company of the 32nd who hadn't been involved in the fighting that day to reinforce the people who were coming back from the battle. But ultimately, Chinhun was a complete disaster. And one can really say from that day, they were literally chased all the way back to the gates of the residency. They were not pursued into the residency, which was interesting. The sepoys did not take the advantage and fight their way into the compound. They let them retreat. But from that day on, the siege started.
Well, your book obviously goes into great detail about the residency and the compound and the buildings. So if I pull up a map now, can you give us a bit of a description of the residency compound? How big was it? Some of the key buildings, that sort of thing, just for someone who's never been.
Well, the residency at the moment is much smaller than it was before. Originally, it would have been approximately 37 acres. It's been shrunk down to about 32, I believe. And it was a collection of buildings which were all residential buildings. They were not intended for defense. So it also had a lot of outbuildings, like we can see the sheep house, slaughterhouse. That's exactly what they were. The sheep house was where they kept the sheep, and the slaughterhouse is where they slaughtered them. And there were a lot of other outbuildings as well. It also had a church with 12 steeples and very big windows, which wasn't really good for defense. None of the buildings were actually intended to be defended in war. They were meant to be cool and comfortable with large windows, big verandas, very pleasant gardens. So basically, the main buildings in the residency were all used for defense, and the outer buildings were also used for people to live in. The main building where the women and children lived was either in the underground chambers in the residency building itself or in the Begum Koti, which was a very large and strong building, pretty much in the center of the residency compound. So, for anyone who's going there now, it is always good to remember that none of these buildings were intended for defense, which also explains why they fell apart so quickly, because they were not constructed for this. They were reinforced, but they were not made to withstand constant shelling for 5 months.
Well, let me pull up a picture now then of the Bailey Guard Gate. So visitors today, this is the first thing they'll see as they approach the residency compound. But I believe there was also quite a bit of action and a lot of interest around this area during the fighting. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of what happened and maybe if there was any interesting characters around here?
The Bailey Guard Gate, actually, was interesting to point out is that initially the residency compound was called the Bailey Guard. It hadn't been called the residency from the beginning. It was called the Bailey Guard by the man who was the first resident. So the name the residency came along much later. But anyway, the Bailey Guard Gate during the siege had been banked up from the inside with earth to make it, a little bit more substantial. So when the relieving forces arrived, they had to come in through the side doorway. During the residency, it was called the Atkins Battery, and it was manned by Robert Hope Moncrieff Atkin and the remains of the 13th Native Infantry, which amounted to not more than 200 men. And they had constructed on the inside of it a battery of 18-pounders to the left of the Bailey Guard, and on the road leading up from the gateway, there were two 9-pounders and an 8-inch howitzer put on position on the road, so to give the gate a little bit of support. And the attached to the Bailey Guard Gate is the treasury, and that's where the men from the regiment and Atkins and his officers lived during the entire siege. They never left their post, and they always stayed there. He remained with his men, and they fought very, very valiantly. Atkins himself would receive the Victoria Cross, and his citation is so incredibly long. It would basically make a story for itself. He was a very, very active man, and he wasn't going to let anyone get the better of him. When the rebels were trying their best to get through the Bailey Guard Gate, one of the things they did is they lighted big bales of cotton and sent them charging up to the gate. They rolled them down to the gate in an idea that they would burn down the wooden gate. And what he did, together with his sepoys, he got some water carriers together from his regiment. They partially opened the gate, put out the fire, and he had his men stand there during the entire time the poor water carriers were putting out the fire, completely exposed. They were shooting their way at the sepoys on the other side. He also arranged for the saving of cattle that had been left behind for some reason on the lower parts of the grounds. He cut away some tents that had been very foolishly left in the lower grounds as well, because what they had done initially, they'd buried the powder magazine on the lower grounds of the residency, thinking that it would be safe there, only to realize, well, this was not very convenient. So they had to dig it all up and bring it into the compound itself, up close to the residency building and to the Begum Koti. And so Atkins was very, very active in keeping his men together, and in being the first line of defense for keeping the mutineers out.
And then one of the other buildings that you talk about in your book that's very interesting is Anderson's Post. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Where was it and why was it important and who was there?
Anderson's Post is located on the very far end of the Residency. It was a very exposed post. It was on the left flank of the defenses, and they were basically just about 40 yards away from the rebel forces, and to the left side, and about 80 yards from the front of the house. So they were, pretty much they could see their faces and they could hear them speaking. It was that close. And during the attacks, they were shelled. Shells were thrown over Anderson's Post from the post office behind, and from other positions. So they were basically being, if one of the shells went wrong, it would land on Anderson's house. So he was basically being shelled from the inside and the outside if he wasn't too careful. And so a lot of damage that was caused to the post came not just from enemy shelling, it was also from friendly fire from his own people. And the other thing, of course, because of the close proximity to the wall, there was a lot of digging of mines going on. He had quite a hard time, keeping his post together, because Captain Anderson, he had only had a small detachment of the 32nd, 8 civilians, and at no given time did he have any more than 20 men at his post. And one of the most interesting features, of course, about Anderson's Post is the fact that the volunteers that he had, they were men of from civil service. Many of them had not seen military service before. They could fire guns. Everyone hunted in India at the time, but they were not a trained force. So they've been their training had only started in May, and here they were being expected to be soldiers, and some of them were not. They had a lot of training that they needed to get through first, but there wasn't really much time. Basically, as long as they could shoot straight, they could volunteer. And they were quite a wide variety of characters at Anderson's Post. There was an alabaster salesman from Italy. There was the editor of the Lucknow Star newspaper. We had a rapeseed salesman. There was a fellow who had just received a contract for opium, to be an opium merchant. So he had quite a wide variety of men to deal with, and they were also not all British. There was Italians, we had Swiss, we had Germans. So everyone was pretty much putting together a rather international force at Anderson's Post. And the other thing, of course, was because the building was so desperately battered, part of it fell down very early in the siege, and it was a veranda that came crashing down. And unfortunately, there was a Mr. Capper of the civil service who was buried under the rubble. He was lucky enough that how the beams had fallen, they didn't crush him, but he was stuck underneath these rather large wooden beams, and a lot of bricks and dust and rubble. And they basically figured, okay, Mr. Capper is dead, until Mr. Capper started shouting, no, I'm not, and you can dig me out if you only try hard enough. And at that very moment, they were being shelled and they were being shot at. So it wasn't quite the easiest way to dig a man out. But William Oxenham of the 32nd and Captain Anderson crawled out on their stomachs and started digging out Mr. Capper by hand, until they finally got the man out from under the rubble. And Capper finally was only just slightly bruised and a little bit out of breath. And he would go on to become Anderson's right-hand man at the post. He was the most trusted civilian that he had.
Wow. And
Worth saving him.
and am I right in thinking Oxenham won a Victoria Cross for that action?
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And Mr. Capper actually tried to secure a Victoria Cross for Captain Anderson. But by the time he got through all the red tape, it was decided it was too late to give him a VC.
Yeah.
So Anderson didn't get the VC, but Mr. William Oxenham did. Yes.
And it's probably a good time to actually, for anyone who doesn't know, just to give a brief overview of the fact that as you've just alluded to, there were a lot of civilians in the compound, wasn't there? Especially women and children also, who you talk about in the book. Can you just give us a brief sense of who else was there other than the soldiers, and what sort of numbers we're talking?
Well, the numbers are a little bit difficult because the women and children were not necessarily counted correctly. I mean, they made a bit of a differentiation in class, whether they were, women of wives of sergeants and drummers and musicians, and if they were ladies. So we have a bit of a discrepancy in the numbers. But according to Julia Inglis, there were approximately 500 women and children at the start of the siege. They were dotted pretty much all around the compound. They kept them out of the most exposed positions, but they had to pretty much fend for themselves as things went along. Uh, the ladies, the wives of the officers, for example, Julia Inglis, they had it a little bit better because they were able to bring in their own supplies before the siege started. But for example, some women like Kate Bartram, who had escaped from Gondar, she arrived with the clothes on her back, and not being an influential woman, she ended up living in a room with 24 other women at the very beginning, and they were left with whatever the commissariat could give them. So they didn't have the easiest time. And of course, there was a lot of other people in the residency as well that history would forget, and those were the servants. Many of them deserted and ran off. Some remained. But for example, Lucknow Kavanagh talks about some posts having as many as 20 servants, employees who'd remained with their employers for the siege. Many of them, as I said, many of them deserted and they ran away. But then there were also what would be called camp followers, as we've already mentioned at the belly guard. There were the water carriers of the regiment who'd stayed with the regiment, and these are all the unaccounted civilians. And of course, the numbers are again not very clear. Some accounts give them as many as 700, but a lot of them did leave. They didn't all remain. The conditions for them were so horrific that it was better to jump the wall and run for it rather than remain in the residency.
Well, you've mentioned some interesting characters. Now's probably a good time to ask you. Let's focus specifically on maybe some of the military characters you've come across. During your research, who really leapt out at you as someone very interesting who you think it's worth talking about? Someone with a great story, or someone just for you personally who really resonated with you?
Well, that's difficult to say. There's quite a few of them. One really has to pick and choose a little bit. I think there were two that very much resonated with me. One of them, of course, is a Swiss man named Rutz Ries, mainly because he wrote a very interesting book, but also because he was a civilian, and he gives us an insight into life in the residency, not from a military point of view, but from a man who actually didn't have a vested interest in the British. I mean, he was there as a salesman. He had been a teacher at the Martiniere College for a while. When that went bust, he was a salesman in sundry goods, mainly rapeseed. And he was in Lucknow by accident. He had left Kanpur, being told he has urgent business in Lucknow. And of course, when he left Kanpur, Kanpur went mad, and he was trapped in Lucknow. But so he was a very interesting man, because we see from him, the little things like the poor food that they were getting, the terrible weather, the fact that he caught a cold and he was still expected to stand around in wet, muddy trenches. He talks about how people were auctioning off the belongings of the dead, so we get an idea of how expensive things were. We also get an idea of how the civilians in general were also looked down upon. The military men didn't quite hold much stock by them in the very beginning, because how can you train a force like this in so little time? But Rees was, of course, one of the men who was in the voluntary cavalry at Chinhun, so he did bring quite a lot to it. And from him, we get very much an insight into what life was like, not just for the military men, but for the men who had to take orders and do as they were told. And the other one, of course, that stands out, the obvious choice would be Lucknow Kavanagh, but Kavanagh gets a lot of press anyway. The other one, of course, is Captain George Fulton. Captain George Fulton was mainly in charge of mining, and he uh, was considered by many as the defender of the Residency. He never stopped. Fulton was everywhere. He organized the volunteers. He organized the miners. He started the entire mining operations. He carried on to the very end, with sorties outside of the compound. Very energetic and very interesting man, who was uh, who was yeah, unfortunately killed before he could get the recognition that he deserved. He's buried in the compound, so his grave is still there. But yes, it was George Fulton who was keeping the Residency alive, and they also said he was a very um, positive man. He never looked on the gloomy side of things, so he was going to see this through with as much panache and jokes as he could, and that, of course, gave a lot of encouragement to the others around him.
I'm interested in your perspective, sort of more on a broader level now. Was the siege, did we see very intelligent use of tactics by the sepoys? Was it a well conducted siege? Or was it a bit of a mess and that's why the compound was never actually captured? How would you sum that up? What do you think?
Well, I think essentially it was a bit of a mess. There were a lot of concentrated attacks on the Residency, but the sepoys were not able to follow them through. Whether it was out of fear, whether it was lack of leadership, which of course was a very big problem. We have to remember that the native officers in the Bengal army were not trained to the same level as the European officers, while they'd never been given concentrated leadership training. And of course, the force outside of the compound was very large, and it also consisted not just of sepoys from mutinied regiments. It also consisted of men from the outlying areas who were not, they were not a fighting force in that respect of organization. So yes, it was a bit of a mess, and the British themselves didn't understand why they hadn't been beaten out. I mean, even in the mining operations, the idea was good that the sepoys did sink 37 mines towards the Residency, but only one was successful, and the rest were either stopped, blown up, uh, caved in, or abandoned. So there was never really a concentrated effort by the sepoys to take the Residency. Um, and one of the interesting things is that there was a sepoy who mentioned very poignantly that one of the problems was that they were disheartened. They had mutinied under the impression that they would gain quick victory and that all of their wishes would be fulfilled, basically, and nothing ever happened. And there were also a great majority of sepoys who possibly didn't want to mutiny, but they were taken on by the tide. So they were morally disheartened by what was going on around them. And one of them said that the betrayal of his salt um, caused pain in the army. So they were never really able to get their act together.
And what about the British? Would you say this was a sort of perfect example of good old fashioned British pluck? They had a great plan and they stuck to it? Or was it a bit of a shambles and they were kind of lucky to survive? What's your impression?
I think it was a very good example of British pluck because they had no reinforcements coming in, they had no supplies coming in. Basically, what they had is what they had, and the idea was well, either we're going to make the best of it or we're all going to die. And since dying was not an option, they were going to make the best of it. So they worked with whatever material they had. So, for example, if they needed to patch up a big hole in one of the walls, they used shutters. They dragged over a piano and stuck it in the hole. Yes, they had a piano in the residency. They used a very valuable collection of Oriental books to plug up holes in the Sikh square after it was blown up by a mine. They were constantly at work reinforcing their position and making sure that even if they were going to be forced out, they were going to make the best of it. So it wasn't, they were not under any illusions. They already knew what had happened in Kanpur. There was, and Kanpur, we have to imagine, happened before the Battle of Chinhun. So, they were already well aware that their chances in surrender were very, very small. They couldn't trust that they would be relieved by anyone.
Just for anyone who doesn't know, Cawnpore, of course, was a similar siege not too far away where many of the survivors were massacred after surrendering. Just for anyone who's not sure what that reference was to.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. Yes, of course. Kanpur, Kanpur pretty much decided their attitude as to how they were going to live out this siege. They were either going to be beaten or they were going to die trying. And I mean, there were stories that at one point when things were rather grim, English even considered undermining the buildings and just blowing themselves up rather than surrender.
Yeah.
Women were sleeping with bottles of poison under their pillows. Yeah, and they asked their husbands to shoot them rather than surrender. So they were in a very desperate situation. They were just extremely lucky that Havelock showed up when he did, and then even more lucky that Colin Campbell was able to break through. But if those two things hadn't happened, they either would have starved to death or they would have been forced to their knees at some point because they would have run out of supplies and ammunition.
Yeah. And if anyone's watching and wants to know a little bit more about the other battles of the conflict, I do have a whole playlist about the Indian Mutiny. So please check that out, guys, for a bit more of the broader context. So thanks a lot to Eva for that brilliant chat. Be sure to look her up on Twitter and to get a copy of her book. It's a cracking read. On a small housekeeping note, guys, this is the first of my new midweek interview series that I hope to release on a maybe bi-weekly schedule. The videos might be less polished, less edited than my normal Friday videos, but it will allow me a chance to share quirkier, more niche research that I think you're going to enjoy with people whose books I've enjoyed. Anyway, YouTube thinks that you're going to enjoy this video that's on screen now, so check it out.